Thanks, Avis. Thanks so much for organizing this, and thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking today about what I'm going to call structuralism about physical properties, which is roughly the idea that physical properties are structural properties in some sense or other. And that idea has played a kind of major role in recent philosophical discussions of consciousness. And that's mainly because of the influence of a view that's called, which many of you will know, is called Russellian Monism. And for this talk, I just really have two aims. My first aim is just to set out for you what that view is, as I understand it, and also to say something about the role of structuralism in it, the role that physical properties are structural, of the idea that physical properties are structural properties in that view. And then I want, in the second part, to develop an objection to Russellian monism, according to which there really isn't any notion of a structural property that can play the role that Russellian monism demands of that notion. I'm sympathetic with Russellian monism, as will emerge. I've written in defense of it in the past, but I think it does face this problem, and that's the problem I want to develop in the paper. So just to get things going, let's begin with a quotation from Russell. This is from Human Knowledge from 1948. And Russell says, I conclude, so he's concluding his discussion of the mind-body issue, roughly speaking, I conclude that while mental events and their qualities can be known without inference, physical events are known only as regards their space-time structure. The qualities that compose such events are unknown, so completely unknown that we cannot say either that they are or that they are not different from the qualities that we know as belonging to mental events. So passages like this raise obviously many questions. They raise the question of, how to understand it just on its own terms. When Russell says we cannot say either that they are or they are not, I don't think he quite means that we can't say that. I think he means, in context, I think he's saying we can't say with certainty either that they are or they are not, but I think he thinks that we can, in fact, say that physical events are mental events or something of that nature. That's sort of one question. Another question is how his position here in this book relates to earlier positions that he advanced, in particular in the Analysis of Matter, which is the Russell book, which most people refer to when they talk about Russellian monism, which was published in 1927. But then there's also the question, which is what I'm going to be interested in, which isn't so much a scholarly question. I'm not really competent to talk about scholarly matters about Russell, but the issue is, can we kind of swoop kind of magpie-like over what Russell says and take ideas from it for our own purposes? And that's what happens. That's what the Russellian monist does. They're sort of inspired by Russell rather than trying to be faithful to exactly to what he says. And so what then is Russellian monism? Well, I think we can think of it as being combined into three theses, RM1, RM2, RM3. And I'll formulate them this way. RM1 says, physical theory reports the instantiation of only structural properties. And RM2 says, non-structural properties are also instantiated. And RM3 says, non-structural properties are relevant to the nature of consciousness. So let me say something about each of these theses. So first, RM1, physical theory reports the instantiation of only structural properties. I think the basic idea behind this thesis is that physical theory or physics is selective in the story that it tells us about nature or about the physical world, somewhat in the way that we ordinarily think of perception as selective. So when I see an object, I can come to know certain properties about the object, perhaps its color or its shape, perhaps its relative position, perhaps other things too. But it's a natural idea that perception only tells us a limited story about the things that we see. Well, likewise, the idea of RM1 is that physical theory is selective. It only tells us a partial story about objects in the world. And the notion of structure is brought in initially to mark that sort of limit. It doesn't say very much about what the limit is. It just says we can know only some of the properties, and that class of properties we can call the structural properties. Now, you might think, well, that thesis sounds as if it's a thesis in, you know, philosophy of physics or something of that kind, since it's about what physical theory is saying. But I don't think that this sort of theory is properly understood in that way. It's not sort of limited to physics. It's not as if other forms of empirical inquiry would not be limited to structural properties. It's, I think, more generally intended to follow from a kind of general a priori, or perhaps just a very general claim about empirical knowledge in general. So empirical knowledge, perhaps with some exceptions, perhaps an exception might be introspection, or perhaps maybe direct perception in certain cases. But very largely, empirical knowledge in general is limited, somewhat in the way that perception itself is limited to structural properties. So that's the idea behind RM1. RM2 says non-structural properties are also instantiated. And we can think about this thesis as being motivated by two ideas, or at least can follow from two claims or ideas. And one is that just that structural properties are instantiated. Suppose, using empirical inquiry of the kind that's suggested in RM1, that we discover that certain structural properties are instantiated. Then if we have this second conditional claim, namely if they're instantiated, then non-structural properties are instantiated as well. We can infer, obviously, that non-structural properties are instantiated. And that second claim is intended to be some sort of a priori claim. So in that sense, we can infer that there are non-structural properties that are instantiated. Now, a number of issues arise here. One is, where on earth did that conditional premise come from? The claim that says if structural properties are instantiated, non-structural properties are also instantiated. That's a good question. The plausibility of that claim depends a lot, I think, on how we interpret the notion of a structural property. So let me just, you know, put a pin in that for the moment. Another point about this is that there's a sort of a good sense, though a pretty elusive sense, in which this idea leaves us ignorant about what the non-structural properties are that are instantiated. We know certain things about them. We know that they're instantiated. We know that they're non-structural. We know that they're related to structural properties in certain ways, but beyond that, we don't know very much about them. So that's RM2. RM3 says non-structural properties are relevant to the nature of consciousness. What does relevant mean? Well, it's a weasel word, of course, but I'm going to take it here to be something like, well, the non-structural facts, in other words, the instantiations of non-structural properties, at least partially ground facts about consciousness, perhaps together with structural facts. And the sort of suggestion in the background, of course, is that structural facts on their own don't ground consciousness. You need the non-structural facts as well. And here, it's consciousness is the thing that emerges in RM3. It didn't emerge in RM1 and RM2, the first two theses of Russellian monism. And actually, the point I want to make here is that the conjunction of RM1 and RM2, the claim that physical theory tells us only about structural properties, but in addition, non-structural properties are instantiated, that's actually quite a common idea in philosophy in various forms. You get it in traditional kind of 20th century forms of materialism, for example. If you look at sort of Armstrong's version of materialism, he's pretty much committed to something like RM1 and RM2, and other people in different contexts are committed to something like that too. So that's not by itself that unusual. What makes Russellian monism distinctive, at least in the context of philosophy of mind and discussions of consciousness, is RM3. it's because, well, RM3 is the thing that connects it up to consciousness. It's these non-structural things are somehow relevant to consciousness. And so why should we believe anything along the lines of RM3? Well, you might think it's just speculation. That might be a suggestion that you could extract from that Russell passage that I began with. But I think there's another reason, a better reason perhaps, and that is that that comes from reflection on this famous conceivability argument, which many of you, I'm sure, will know. So this argument just is a straightforward argument against materialism. And it says, premise one, it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in respect of all physical properties, but different from me in respect of some psychological properties. Premise two, if that's conceivable, then it's possible. Premise three, if that's possible, then materialism is false. And conclusion, materialism is false. So I think the Russellian monist who looks at this argument begins with a kind of big, but I think a defensible claim, and that is that no standard response to this argument works. What do I mean by a standard response? Well, one standard response might be to concede that the argument is sound and then develop some kind of standard dualism or something. Or perhaps to do that conditional on the existence of consciousness and then to deny the existence of consciousness, perhaps like an illusionist or something. Or perhaps focusing on the premises of the argument, it might be that we just simply deny that this thing is conceivable as it's asserted to be in premise one, or we deny the inference from conceivability to possibility. I'll set aside premise three. I get from the abstracts, it looks as if Barbara Montero might say something relevant to that. But in any case, the Russellian monist is thinking that none of these sort of standard responses to this argument are going to work. And I think a lot of us in our quieter moments might feel the force of that point, or at least we might think that all of the standard responses, apart from our favorite one, are not going to work. And so it would be quite natural to believe that none of the standard responses work. So that suggests that we need some sort of non-standard response to this argument. And what might be a non-standard response? Well, an obvious non-standard response begins with something which I've called elsewhere the ignorance hypothesis. And that just says, well, just forget about the argument for a minute. Let's just imagine this hypothesis, which could, after all, be true, namely that there's a type of physical property which meets two conditions. First, we're ignorant of it, ignorant of its nature. And second, that it's relevant to consciousness. That's just a hypothesis about our situation. It might be right. It might not be right. Why is that of interest? It's of interest because it gives us a way to defeat the conceivability argument. And the way that it does it is by focusing on the first premise, the conceivability claim. It's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in respect of all physical properties, but different from me in respect of some psychological properties. And it focuses in on the quantifier phrase, all physical properties. And it says, well, look, if the ignorance hypothesis is true, which of course it might be true, then that phrase, all physical properties, can be interpreted in one of two ways. And either way, the argument fails, roughly speaking. So if we agree with the ignorance hypothesis, we have a kind of straightforward response to this argument. What are the two ways of interpreting it? Well, there's a kind of a broad way and a narrow way. On the broad interpretation, we take the phrase, all physical properties, to include the properties of which we are ignorant according to this hypothesis. If the hypothesis is true, there are properties of which we're ignorant, which are relevant to the nature of consciousness. We can take the phrase, all physical properties, we can interpret that phrase in such a way that those properties are included within it. And if that's the case, then the first premise of the conceivability argument won't be true in the relevant sense. We won't be able to conceive of a situation in which I have all the physical properties I have and not some psychological property. One might be able to do other things that might be called conceiving. One might be able to suppose that that's true, for example, but that won't be the kind of conceiving that has sort of probative value in modal reasoning. And so it won't be the kind of conceiving that will make the first premise true. So that's what happens if you interpret this phrase, all physical properties, in a broad way to include the properties that are discussed in the ignorance hypothesis. Well, what about if we go for the narrow version? where we take all physical properties and we interpret it in such a way that it excludes those properties, that it doesn't include those properties, then the conceivability argument establishes only that consciousness comes apart from some physical properties, not that it comes apart from all. And that is not a problematic conclusion, you might think. So that's a sort of a non-standard response to the conceivability argument. Now, what has this got to do with Russellian monism? Well, the answer is that the Russellian monists, as I've been setting it out, those three theses, RM1, RM2, and RM3, entail that the ignorance hypothesis is true, or at least entail it with some further assumptions which are defensible. Why is that? Well, it entails that non-structural properties, the ones that we know to exist according to RM1 and RM2, are a type of property of which we're ignorant, but which are relevant to consciousness. Are they a type of physical property? Well, yes, so long as we understand physical property in a broad enough way. Sometimes we might want to use the word physical property to restrict it to structural properties of which we know, but we might also want to use it in a broad way so that it would include those properties that, according to the Russellian monist, are non-structural and whose nature we don't know. As I mentioned, some traditional versions of physicalism actually will require that, so that it's not an unusual move to use the word physical property in this broad sense. And if that's the case, then Russellian monism entails the ignorance hypothesis, and therefore it makes available this kind of non-standard response to the conceivability argument. Now, you might say, well, maybe if Russellian monism is true and all of the sort of animadversions about structural properties are correct, then we get the ignorance hypothesis. But why couldn't we have the ignorance hypothesis independently? After all, it looks as if there's nothing about structural properties in that hypothesis. We could advance it just on general grounds rather than on structuralist grounds, more or less. After all, we're not angels. We don't know everything. Maybe we should just assert the ignorance hypothesis. Well, I think that proponents of the Russellian monism want to say at this point that there isn't really any alternative way of believing the ignorance hypothesis. And the way that they do that is by appealing again to the structural, non-structural distinction. The idea is, well, suppose that that hypothesis is true, and there are properties of which we're ignorant, but which are relevant to consciousness. Well, the question is, are those structural properties or not? If they're structural properties, then they won't make a difference, roughly speaking, to the philosophical situation that we're in. And if they're non-structural properties, then the position is exactly the same as the Russellian monist position. So in other words, the structure, non-structure distinction plays kind of two roles in the Russellian monist position. It first of all plays the obvious role, which is it permits you to formulate these three core theses, which the view is dependent on, or which constitute the view, I'm sorry. But then in addition, they come in as a sort of secondary role where they where they basically show not only is there a way out of this problem presented by the conceivability argument, but in fact, this is the only way out. That's the position of Russellian monism. Now, let me finish this sketch of the Russellian monism by just mentioning a distinction which is prominent in Dave Chalmers' discussion of this issue, and which I think is a bit of a red herring. And that's the distinction, as he puts it, between the way that he presents this issue is that you can come away thinking, well, there are really two kinds of Russellian monist view. There's the so-called panpsychist view, on which the non-structural properties that we've been talking about are themselves phenomenal properties, or properties associated with consciousness of an unusual sort, perhaps. And then there's a position which Dave calls panprotopsychist Russellian monist, according to which non-structural properties have a nature which is unknown. Now, I think one should resist the sort of framing of Russellian monism in terms of this distinction, because it gives the impression that the Russellian monist is either in fact a panpsychist, or is a kind of panpsychist in their heart, something, a position that kind of wants to be panpsychist, but won't quite say it. That's the panprotopsychist view. But I think that's a mistaken way to think about it. The first thing to say is that, like other people, I think that panpsychism is interesting but implausible on its own terms. But I also don't think it's a terribly good thing for the Russellian monist to become a panpsychist for sort of independent reasons. And that is because it's unclear how a position like that stands with respect to the ignorance hypothesis. Because the whole idea is that we have an answer to the conceivability argument if we don't know the nature of these properties. But if we go on to assert that those properties are phenomenal, then there's a sense in which we know perfectly well what their natures are, at least to the extent that we know the natures of properties at all. So actually panpsychism, whatever its pros and cons, doesn't seem to me to sit terribly well with Russellian monism, at least the impulse behind Russellian monism as I understand it. Well, what about panprotopsychism? Well, I think this view is sort of badly named, partly for the reasons I've just been mentioning, namely that you know, the Russellian monism as I've formulated so far, has little to do with panpsychism. It's true you can combine it with panpsychism if you want, but by itself it doesn't have much to do with panpsychism. And this particular title seems to implicate strongly that it does. And then in addition, there's the point that more or less any position could be described as panprotopsychism, because if suppose you're the most straightforward kind of materialist, you know, you're smart or you're Hobbes or something, well, then you'll think that there are some fundamental objects which are physical and that they presumably have some capacity in them, namely to come together to build consciousness. And so those things will be, that sort of position will likewise be a kind of pan-proto-psychist position. But that's a sort of I think a misleading way to describe a kind of traditional materialism. So I don't think this way of thinking about Russellian monism is terribly revealing of what it is. Nevertheless, I think that what Dave calls pan-proto-psychist Russellian monism, perhaps what we can just call Russellian monism, is a kind of an attractive view for the reasons I've been mentioning, because it gives us a kind of best of both worlds kind of response to the conceivability argument. Okay, so that's the sketch of the view. Let me now turn to the problem I want to talk about in the second half of the talk. So I think the big problem is this, namely, is there a version of the structural, non-structural distinction that permits Russellian monism to be true? And what I mean by that is that permits those three theses to be jointly true. What exactly is a structural property? And what is the distinction between a structural and a non-structural property? And is it the case that there's some understanding of these notions that permit those theses to be true? Well, in order to give this question some shape, we can kind of impose some, we can think about, you know, what you might say if you're trying to say what a structural property is. And I think that what you might say is that you might try to complete a kind of definition of this form. You know, F is a structural property if and only if F can be defined using some specific set of notions, very roughly. You know, maybe logical notions, or maybe logical and causal notions, or maybe any other notion. But anyway, what we were looking for is some sort of definition like that. I don't mean a kind of reductive definition necessarily. I just mean a kind of an account of what a structural property would be. So F is a structural property if it can be defined using some specific set of notions. But now I think we're going to confront a dilemma. And the dilemma is that if the notions that you have in mind are understood in an extremely kind of restricted way, then I think it's just going to be implausible that physics, and of course, when I talk about physics here, I mean empirical inquiry in general, is limited to structural properties. So if you understand structural properties in this rather abstemious or limited way, then the first claim of Russellian monism won't be true. It just won't be true that there's this limit on what we can come to know via physical theory. On the other hand, if you understand the notions in some sort of expansive way, which it's open to you to do, then I think it will be implausible that either that the non-structural properties, so understood, are instantiated at all, or that they are relevant to the notion of consciousness. So in other words, it'll turn out that either RM2 or RM3 will be false. So basically, of the three theses I was talking about, if you understand the notion of a structural property in a restricted way, then the first thesis will be false. And if you understand it in an expansive way, then one or other of the second two will be, of the second and third thesis will be false. Well, in order to give you some kind of, that's just an outline of a dilemma. Let's have a look and see how it might work in practice. Well, here's how I think it might work in practice. So we can begin with what you might call a Russell-inspired view. Of course, as I mentioned before, the whole of Russellian monism in any way is to some extent inspired by Russell. But we can imagine an extremely restricted notion of a structural property, where we just basically say, look, F is a structural property just in case. F can be defined using only logical and mathematical notions. Views like this are sometimes attributed to Russell's analysis of matter, for example. And I think on this view, it's RM1, the claim that physical theory tells us only about structural properties, is extremely implausible, because it's implausible that the only thing we can come to know through empirical inquiry is the instantiation of logical and mathematical properties, or something of that kind, or at least properties definable in terms of logical and mathematical notions. And this is closely related to the sort of famous Newman problem for Russell, which is, roughly speaking, that on this kind of understanding, physical statements end up being so abstract that more or less anything can make them true. That's roughly the idea. So that's a very restricted notion, and I think on that notion, it's clear that the first thesis of Russellian monism isn't true. Well, let's go to the other extreme. The other extreme might be what I'll call a Lewis-inspired view, not a Russell-inspired view. And in talking of Lewis here, I have in mind Lewis's well-known paper, Ramseyan Humility, where many of you may be familiar with that paper, but just to give a kind of very quick cartoonish sketch that's sufficient for our purposes, what Lewis argues in that paper is that there's a sort of inevitable kind of ignorance that we have of certain kinds of properties in the world, properties that he calls quidities. Quidities stand to properties roughly like hexieties stand to individuals. And the general idea is that no matter what the final theory of the world is, if we knew that theory, we still wouldn't be able to nail down which quidities are instantiated in the world, and therefore we wouldn't know something about those properties. And now that sort of, as I say, a kind of cartoonish summary of one of the ideas, at any rate, in that sort of paper, in that paper. Now we can use that idea to give us an extremely expansive notion of a structural property. And here the extremely expansive notion is basically F is a structural property if and only if. F can be defined using any notions at all that are of use in the final theory, whatever that theory is. And the idea is that whatever that theory is, we can still draw the distinction between structural properties and non-structural properties by saying that the non-structural properties will just be the quidities that Lewis is talking about. And it may be that we can now formulate a version of Russellian monism using that notion of a structural property and a non-structural property. But while we can go along with that, I mean, it's of course, it's a big question whether the kind of argument that Lewis presented in that paper is a good argument. But suppose we go along with it and we draw the structure, non-structure distinction in that way, inspired by that sort of picture, then the distinction between structural properties and non-structural properties pretty much is the distinction between quidities, which are the non-structurals, and everything else, which are the structurals. The problem is that sort of view will make RM3 false. RM3 says that that the non-structural properties are relevant to the notion of consciousness. But it's hard to see how quiddities are relevant to the notion of consciousness. They just don't seem to ground the fact that a person is conscious or feels a particular way or anything of the kind. They just don't have the right kind of shape to bear on that kind of problem. So we can sort of formulate our dilemma this way. We can say, well, either we go for the Russell-inspired view where we have an extremely restricted notion of a structural property, and then the first thesis of Russellian monism is false, or we can go for the incredibly expansive Lewis-inspired view, which basically permits any property you like as long as it's not a quiddity, and that will render false the third constituent thesis. Okay, so obviously at this point you might think, well, isn't there aren't there some intermediate positions that we could explore? And I think there are some intermediate positions. And so what I'll do in the final bit is just look at some of them, and we can perhaps discuss them as well in the question period. So there are various intermediate positions. An obvious one is to basically take the Russell style view and weaken it. And basically you do that by saying, well, F is a structural property just in case F can be defined using either logical mathematical notions or some other kind of notion. And then you say what the other kind of notions are. And the disjunction here is some sort of non-exclusive disjunction, presumably. So an obvious move, which is in fact quite common, is to say, well, maybe a structural property is either a logical or mathematical, defined using either logical or mathematical notions, or perhaps causal or nomological notions. And here I mean, I don't mean any notion that includes sort of causal notions or nomological notions. I literally mean, words like causes or it is a law that, something like that. And I think on this view, RM1 still remains implausible. And one of the reasons for that is that like logical and mathematical notions, causal and nomological notions are kind of topic neutral. They don't tell you very much about the world. If all I know about the world is that there are three things in it which have these logical properties, and the first one causes the second one to do something to the third, that's all I know. I still don't know something about the nature of the world. And that seems to be just the wrong picture of what our empirical knowledge tells us. Well, what about if we add something else? We could add, well, logical mathematical notions or causal or nomological notions, or perhaps spatiotemporal notions. And in fact, that's a natural suggestion because, as we saw right at the beginning, Russell is, of course, talking about space-time and so on. But the problem here is what a spatiotemporal notion is supposed to be, whether it's restricted in certain ways or not. And you might think, well, a spatiotemporal notion is just any notion at all which is involved in a theory of space-time, or perhaps even a theory of space-time and the constituents of space-time. And if that's the case, it's going to be unclear why RM2 is true. Remember, RM2 says we know that non-structural properties are also instantiated, and we can reason in that way a priori. But why would that be the case if we have such an expansive notion of a structural property? Why would we think, well, any property at all about space-time, we can say, well, if it's instantiated, something else must be instantiated. That doesn't seem to be a terribly plausible move. A third intermediate view might be to, again, has the same form. It says logical or mathematical notions or causal and nomological notions, or perhaps phenomenal notions. We could add phenomenal notions. And this is very close to a view suggested by Chalmers. But I think the problem with this view, and I'll just state this, there's quite a lot of things to be said about this, but the problem with this view is roughly that it tends to undermine not just the three theses of Russellian monism, but the sort of conceivability argument. The idea is, remember, in the background of Russellian monism is the thought that the conceivability argument is sound if by physical properties we restrict ourselves to structural properties. But if structural properties are defined in terms of phenomenal notions, then it's going to be very hard to see whether the basic premise of the conceivability argument is going to be true. So it looks as if it's sort of going to be self-undermining if you go in this direction. Well, those options all take the Russell style view and kind of weaken it. We can also start from the other side, the expansive Lewis style view, and sort of restrict it. That would be the other move that one could obviously make. And we can think of this as basically having the form, well, F is a structural property just in case. First, F can be defined using any notions invoked in the final theory, whatever that is, and then you impose some further condition on what F is. And now at this point, one might, of course, go back to the notions I've just been talking about, the spatiotemporal notions or phenomenal notions or causal or nomological notions. But I think that will end up being somewhat similar to the points I've just been making. A very common move here is to impose some sort of metaphysical category on the properties in question. And so an obvious way to do it is to say, well, F can be any property at all so long as it's relational or dispositional or extrinsic. Obviously, there's a lot of issues in the relation and difference between relational properties, dispositional properties, and extrinsic properties. But let me pass over that. It doesn't matter too much for our purposes. But the problem with this sort of proposal is that it's just hard to see why physics should be restricted to items of these metaphysical categories. Why can it only tell us about properties that are relational or dispositional or extrinsic, rather than properties that are non-relational or non-dispositional or intrinsic? And if that's the case, then RM1 is false again. And to give a incredibly simple example, you think of Newton. Well, according to Newton, atoms are spherical. And now, being spherical is on the face of it not a relational property or an extrinsic property or a dispositional property. And it may well have been that Newton didn't think of them that way. Now, whether he was right or wrong, you might think, well, he was doing physics, but not on this view, because he was just going beyond what physical theory is supposed to be able to tell you about a priori. So the point of the example is to sort of try to make it clear that there's just no reason why we should impose this restriction. And then just one final one is, I mention this because it's been defended by Dirk Pereboom, interestingly, and it has the sort of same kind of shape. It basically says, well, F is a structural property if it can be defined using any notions at all invoked in the final theory. That's the Lewis style bit. And then you impose a further condition, again, a kind of metaphysical condition on the property, that it's an extrinsic property, or it's what Pereboom calls a comparative intrinsic. And a comparative intrinsic property, as I've said it here on the slide, is one that's, first of all, an intrinsic property. And secondly, that's sort of grounded in the extrinsic properties of the parts of the things that have it. So the basic idea is, here's my hand. It has some sort of shape. For Pereboom, that's a comparative intrinsic property because it's grounded in the extrinsic properties of the parts of the things that have it. I think I should have said a absolute intrinsic property actually here in this intermediate view. We can come back to that. But the problem again is that likewise, it's just hard to see why physical theory would have this restriction built into it. Why should we not be able to talk about absolute extrinsic properties? And as I say in the bottom of the slide, we've got a similar problem, because a property like sphericality in an atom would be, on Pereboom's view, an absolute intrinsic property, but we seem to be able to talk about it perfectly well. Okay, so let me just conclude. So I think that, what can we say? Well, Russellian monism, I think, follows Russell in dropping what he called a kind of an imaginative picture of the physical. That was the emphasis on thinking about the physics in terms of structure and so forth, rather than sort of ordinary notions of matter. And that seems like a good thing to do, of course. But I think that the view follows Russell a bit in retaining a kind of what you might think of as an imaginative picture of physical knowledge, namely that physical knowledge is somehow limited to structure, that there's some way of understanding this limit. And as I've been trying to emphasize, a problem seems to be that there's just no notion of a structural property that can play the role that Russellian monism wants to play. If you understand it a particular way, one of the constituent theses will be false. If you understand it some other way, then some other of the constituent theses will be false. And there's just doesn't seem to be a way through in this Scylla, between sort of Scylla and Charybdis. But I do think it remains the case that Russellian monism is well motivated. I mean, it remains the case that if you were convinced by the idea that none of the standard responses to the conceivability argument is going to work, you would remain convinced by anything that I've said. So Russellian monism seems to be well motivated. It's also plausible that some sort of ignorance view, I think, is a good way to deal with that argument. And in that sense, I think Russellian monism might be the second most attractive view in the philosophy of mind, or the metaphysics of mind. It's sort of on the way to being true. But maybe if we can't deal with this issue of structure versus non-structure, we should just drop it in favor of the most attractive view. And that's where I'll end. So thanks very much.